I think this is a beautiful project. I mean, you don't need me to feel good about Northern, but I feel great about this center. I think America needs a lot more of this. And frankly, I think this kind of interest in civic engagement, the country is hungry for this. I think when you think about things like bipartisanship and progress in Washington, it is a supply problem, it's not a demand problem. I think the American people overwhelmingly would like a Congress that does more and fights less, even if sometimes that's not the message that seems to be most often rewarded, or at least put forth by the politicians. So I think we all want to start by acknowledging that rage and fear are incredibly powerful short-term motivators. Now, they're really lousy long-term motivators. I mean, you would never build a nonprofit or a business or a church or a relationship on fear and anger. They would be destined for failure. I think you'd understand that you would need a mutual respect. Of course you want different opinions, but that the idea of civic engagement, civic discourse, a certain civil way that we would interact with one another would be, you would have to have that at the heart of any relationship. And so okay, Dusty, those are fine words, but what do you do about it? And what I want to do is share two things that I try to do to walk the walk, and then humbly suggest three things that I think we all can do as individual citizens to do a better job fostering positive civic engagement. So the first thing is I try to rhetorically make politics more about addition and multiplication than about division and subtraction. Now again, you get a lot further by talking about division and subtraction. All of the incentives in the system seem to reward bad behavior. Now listen, maybe I'll mention one on the right and one on the left, so as not to, I will offend a lot of people tonight, but I'll try not to do so. But Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Marjorie Taylor Greene, on the left and the right, have a very different way of doing business. They seem to me to be more interested kind of in a political celebrity. I think they want to tell a story. They want to be messengers. Neither of them have passed legislation, and to be honest, they don't appear particularly interested in doing so. And I think when I see what the two of them put out on Twitter, I'm often amazed at how often they're trying to pit you against you or you against me. Now that is a very effective strategy. The incentives in the system reward bad behavior. So at the first quarter of last year, I raised $150,000. Seems like a lot of money to me. I was very happy to have it. Some of you in the room were helpful in that way. Thank you. Marjorie Taylor Greene did not raise $150,000. She didn't raise even twice that. She raised $3.1 million that quarter. They both have dozens of millions of Twitter followers. I would tell you that both of my Twitter followers like what I post. But it is a very different environment. But despite that fact, I try not to fall into the trap of the instant gratification. When I disagree with President Biden, which is quite frequently, I try to criticize his ideas or criticize his actions rather than call him personally named, because that's not actually conducive. We need an America that moves together, and I do not think Republicans have all the answers. I know they don't. And I think, as has always been the case, and will continue to be the case, we're more likely to find abiding, strong policy when we find ideas that have a broad cross-section of appeal. So that's the first thing I try to do, rhetorically try to walk the walk. But secondly, it's also about governance. I'm a member of the Problem Solvers Caucus, which is 29 Democrats and 29 Republicans who have kind of rejected the toxic environment and try to do things together. Now, we are not, by and large, centrists. We're not, by and large, moderates. There are people who are very proudly on the far left. I'm pretty far on the right. My conservative score is 98%. Now, that's higher than the House Republican average, and a lot of America thinks the House Republicans are pretty gosh darn conservative. So it's not as though we don't believe strongly in our worldview. I believe in limited government. It's that I know that in the Nancy Pelosi-controlled House, I'm not going to get a whole loaf. And I don't think the Constitution or my bosses in the state of South Dakota are going to hire me for 2 years at a time just to go complain. And so with that group, we have come together to do a number of very meaningful legislative packages that I think have tried to strike the right balance in moving the country forward. And I'm going to continue to work on those things and have lots more details if you have follow-up questions. But what about for all of us? What can we do? I mean, most of you are not in Congress, and I really hope that none of you run against me. But what can we all do? I think the first thing we've got to do is invest in responsible institutions. It's all very easy and all very fun to blame the media and the politicians. But you do know they're just giving you what you want. They're giving us what we want. Clickbait is clickbait because it works. The more prurient the leading story on Fox News or MSNBC, the more likely people are to stay on and engage in that content and tell those media outlets that they are to give you more of them. And that's why I just tell people from a media perspective, you really go out of your way to try to invest in, whether that's with subscriptions to your local newspapers or by listening to local radio, invest in responsible journalism. And I think there are actually a surprisingly large number of options on both the right and the left that I would categorize as responsible. From the center right, I subscribe to The Economist. It's a very expensive magazine. And I'm frugal enough where I don't really like having to write that check. And they have a worldview that is more in alignment with my worldview than it would be with Joe Biden's. But I think they try to get the facts right. And I think their goal is not to enrage me, but to engage me. And I think that's worth investing in. I think the same thing is true for elected officials. There are people who want to get you angry or afraid. Don't let them. Don't invest in those candidates. Find people who believe in this concept of civic engagement and civil discourse in a way that's productive rather than destructive. That's number one. Number two, illegitimi non carborundum. Now, we were talking about my 4 years of Latin with some of you beforehand. That is the kind of misspent education you get at the University of South Dakota. But that in Latin means don't let the bastards grind you down. There is a tendency for us to see how toxic the environment is, particularly on Twitter and Facebook, and just say, well, the hell with this. I don't need this, right? I am going to go elsewhere. And I don't think the world needs less political engagement from people like you. I think we need more. And so don't allow the toxicity of the bullies and the trolls to force you away, because that's how they've won. I think politics is too important to leave to the politicians, and it's certainly too important to leave to the trolls. So that leads me to my last suggestion, humbly offered for all of you. And that is that I'm not expecting any of you to become a keyboard warrior in the defense of these values that we're talking about tonight. I don't expect that if somebody says something terribly mean about the First Lady, that you will rise to her defense every time. Or if they say something mean about Kristi Noem, that you will rise to her defense every time. I would just ask that once a day, you amplify a constructive viewpoint. Just if somebody else has said something meaningful that advances a conversation that isn't an insult or attack, just give them a thumbs up. Or on Twitter, give them a heart. Just do one thing, because in these algorithms, the more engagement that somebody has with their comment, the more likely it is to be one of the 2 or 3 that show up on the preview on Facebook. And so amplify those discussions, and also you send a subtle message to the person who was willing to wade in and say something productive, that other people have their back. And it doesn't cost you a lot. And so I'd ask you to do that. So I'll close with a story that rocked me back on my heels a little bit. I was at an activation for a National Guard unit. And afterwards, one of the sergeants, this was his 3rd deployment, and 2 of the previous deployments had been in relative hotspots, in areas where people were not free from harm. And he and I were talking about politics, and he said, I just am so grateful that you are willing to do what you do. I can't imagine a post so difficult. You just could have punched me in the gut. That somebody who had literally put his life on the line in the defense of freedom thought that my post was the more challenging. How toxic, how raw, how mean has our politics gotten when literal soldiers feel like mine is the more dangerous assignment? We'll have a better America if we send a different message to our children.